Welcome to Annapolis Mosaics. Our program spotlights people in our community who are involved in activities designed to promote good human relations. I am Michael Keller, your host, and the chair of the Annapolis Human Relations Commission. The commission is a city board which seeks to promote equal opportunity and to eliminate discrimination. My guests today are the Reverend Diana Carroll, who is rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Annapolis, and the Reverend Sarah Lamming, who is the rector of St. Mary Magdalene Episcopal Church in Silver Spring. Diana and Sarah, welcome to Annapolis Mosaics.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Well, both of you have pursued careers in Christian ministries. And at the same time, you are both members of the LGBTQ community. Could each of you share your journey and experiences in dealing with both of those aspects of your lives? And how it's impacted your careers.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to say is not only are we both Episcopal priests, so we're clergy in the Episcopal Church, but we're married to each other. So that's thing one, and that's part of why we're both here today. I grew up in the Episcopal Church. I came out when I was a teenager as bisexual, and I, at the time, would never have thought I would have been called into the ordained ministry. My grandfather is an Episcopal priest, and his father-in-law, my great-grandfather, was a Church of Canada priest, and sort of runs in the family, but I never thought it would have been me. And then while I was in college at Kenyon College in Ohio, I had my first sense of, if I were a priest, I would be using all these different gifts I've identified, writing and public speaking, and I was a stage manager in theater, and I was very organized, and I realized it opened up, and I began to think this might be it. So I was able to be out during the entire ordination process, which I was fortunate in that respect. And I remember my first meeting with my local discernment committee. I was 19 at the time, and I took a while to go through the process because I started pretty young. And I had to write this spiritual autobiography telling my spiritual story up to that point, and I included in there some of the struggles that I had had when I was first coming out and that I identified as bisexual. And I remember them asking what I meant by that. And I said, well, I am looking for someone to spend my life with in a faithful, committed relationship, and it just doesn't matter to me at this point whether that person is male or female. Mm-hmm. And that was honestly the first and last time it came up in my ordination process. It was just a very supportive place to be doing it. And maybe that's a good segue for Sarah to say a little bit about her experience, which was rather different.
Yeah, so I was born in England and grew up in the Church of England. And again, similar to Diana, I had a great uncle who was ordained and a distant cousin who was also ordained. So we had clergy in the family, but never really expected priesthood in my career. But at college, I had this sense of calling. And at that time, I would have described myself as asexual. Didn't really I knew there was something, but couldn't put my finger on it. But I knew the Church of England, it was a don't ask, don't tell. And so I went through the discernment process, talking about being asexual. And then during college, I realized theological college, yeah,
Seminary.
Seminary.
Sorry, I do a lot of translating. I'll try not to do
realized
too much,
that this wasn't. I wasn't called to celibacy, and it wasn't asexual. It was actually that I was gay. But because of this social conditioning, I grew up in England, what was called the Section 28 era, where schools were not allowed to teach anything about homosexuality. And so it wasn't something that I really explored. And then, so once I had kind of acknowledged that to myself, I was like, no, this is who I am. And so I really had to decide how that was going to fit in with my vocation. And the summer prior to coming to Yale Divinity School on exchange, I was like, I'm going to Yale for a semester. Mm-hmm. Let's just see what it feels like to live in the States open. And so I came over to the States, still living very much within the Church of England kind of guidelines. And I was like, this is so freeing. How can I go back living in this closeted way? And the college couldn't believe the difference in the person who left to the person that came back. And so I asked them to write in my report to the bishop that I was gay. Mm-hmm. And they said they couldn't. They wrote that I was an active member of the LGBT Alliance because they didn't want to actually disclose, because that would have put me in jeopardy. So I actually got ordained with my bishop saying, you understand where the Church of England is on the issue of sexuality. And I was able to say yes, but I'm not willing to be silent on the debate. Mm-hmm. And then Diana and I realized that our relationship was a little bit more serious than just friends.
Yeah, we met in that semester mm-hmm. when she was at Yale Divinity School. Mm-hmm. It was an exchange in her third year, and it was my mm-hmm. first year. And we became very good friends, and only literally 11 days before she had to go back to England, mm-hmm. we realized that this was more than friends, and sort of went, well, now what? Yeah. So we were doing long distance. Mm-hmm. We did long distance for 3.5 years because she went back, finished, got ordained, did her 3-year curacy, which is a training position, almost like a medical residency. She was working with a more experienced priest. Yeah. So in that time, we discerned, we felt called to spend our lives together. We wanted to get married, even though that wasn't something that was legally allowed or recognized by either of our churches at mm-hmm. that point. But that, as we understood it, was what we were being called to. And mm-hmm. so we had a choice to make. And Sarah especially had a choice to make.
And in the Church of England, when you make that choice, you would tell your bishop. And so I wanted to hold to the same standard as the heterosexual couples, and I told my bishop, which put me in huge jeopardy. And what I wasn't expecting was that the gay community within the priesthood would be upset because I'd broken the secrecy. Like, I'd broken the unspoken rules. Like, we were told that I could have had a secretary, a housekeeper, a lodger.
Oh yes, I could have been her lodger. Mm-hmm.
But to actually come out and want to live publicly and openly kind of had threatened the way that they had existed. And so they just didn't know how to cope. But I had lived for 3 years in ministry, living these split lives, and it was really hard. And so it was painful leaving England, but living with integrity was the more important. So that's why we came to the Episcopal Church.
In the past 10 years, many religious denominations have become welcoming, or at least more welcoming, to members of the LGBTQ community. We can look at your own church, the Episcopal Church, also the United Church of Christ, the Friends or Quakers, the Unitarian Universalists are all examples of that. But even among some of your younger evangelicals, these are people who would be in their 30s or 20s, have opened a dialogue with people in the LGBT community, and even some progressive older evangelicals who have for many, many years wouldn't touch the issue, have now become much more open. And I'm thinking specifically of individuals who are in the Sojourners community in Washington, D.C. What do you think you can attribute this trend to?
Well, I mean, we're not sociologists, so, I would say I'm sure sociologists could point towards some good evidence that might demonstrate why. I would say, honestly, the biggest reason for things having shifted culturally, which then has contributed to shifts within some Christian denominations or strands of Christianity in this country and other countries around the world. I think the biggest thing has been people coming out, if I'm honest. This is something we've experienced in our own lives, both of us. People getting to know, I mean, not so much now because, we're married, we're public figures. I talk about my wife all the time, but a number of years ago, people might get to know me in a certain context, and then I would come out to them, and they would be floored, and they would say things like, "But you're a woman of God. I can see that you're a woman of God. You're a righteous and spiritual person. How can this possibly be?" And I really think that and people finding out that people who were near and dear to them in their own families were part of the LGBTQ community and had wrestled and struggled with it, I think that's had the biggest impact in changing hearts and minds personally.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is that a lot of the stereotypes were focused on like the bar scenes or like the fluid nature of relationships. So it's always fascinating when people come to our house and just like, oh, it's very ordinary. I mean, in that sense of like,
It's true.
that like we like as a couple we have the same goals as most other couples. We just want like settle down, like have an orderly life, and to realize that it's not actually that different. So
at least for us,
yeah, yeah.
There are certainly folks within the LGBTQ community who aren't interested in the institution of marriage, or who want to push more at the boundaries of conventional expectations of relationships. And so that's very much part of it as well. For us, we're both kind of a little conventional. Well, you like to push the envelope, but I'm definitely really kind of conventional and a bit traditional when it comes down to it. I mean, our second wedding, we wore white dresses. Our dads walked us down the aisle. It was a full church service with communion, and we exchanged rings, and we didn't live together before that wedding. It was really important to us that we be held to the same standard as straight clergy who were expected to not live together with someone before they were married. So, in all those respects, we are, normal.
Well, in any of the houses of worship, and I'm deliberately using that phrase because I want to include both those who are within the Christian denomination as well as those who may profess a different faith, such as Jews or Muslims. And of course, there are strands of belief within those areas, just like there is in Christianity. But within any house of worship, you are going to find, and I'm sure you have found, individuals, as you've mentioned, who struggle with LGBT issues because of doctrinal matters or things that arise out of sacred scripture interpretation. And you're both clergy. So, and you interact with people both within as well as outside of your respective churches. So how do you respond to those individuals who find themselves struggling with the acceptance of LGBT people based on what they are reading in terms of the doctrines and the sacred scriptures of their specific faith? How do you deal with it? How do you respond to it?
So one of the examples I give is I look at the whole texture, take the whole Bible with the multiple books and look at what are the overriding themes. And for me, the overriding theme is the unconditional love of God. And so I start from that and then work back and then look at where was Christ? Christ was with those that were marginalized in society. So, okay, so Christ is with those who are marginalized. Okay, so then what are we going to put to that? And then if we then look at those specific parts of the scripture that they talk about, and then look at what are behind it, and more often than not, it's about abuse of power rather than the actual acts of homosexuality. And then I ask them about, well, why, how do you interpret passages about divorce or slavery or some of the Old Testament about, if I want to be a little kind of pushing the boat, well, what are you wearing? Are you wearing mixed fibers? What do you eat? So talk about how scripture has changed, but talk about that sense of, if it's about God loving us unconditionally and that how our understanding has changed, particularly over sexuality. Sexuality was understood very differently, particularly when the Hebrew scriptures were written. If I believe I'm made in the image of God, I have to live fully into that. And for me to try and be heterosexual is actually counter to how I'm made. And so that's how I have to be. And so Christ wants me to be happy and to be loved, and that's why I am with Diana. And then I'll let you carry on.
No, I mean, I think you said it very well. I think that bit about being made in God's image is a really key piece of it. You know, that's right in the beginning of Genesis. That's very fundamental, that humankind is made in the image of God, and that is a text that is shared among, it's seen as scripture for Christians and also for Jews, and I know is held to some degree as sacred for Muslims as well. So being made in God's image. And part of what we say in the Episcopal Church is that part of living a Christian life is to respect the dignity of every human being. And so, it begins with recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every human because they're made in God's image. They are a reflection of God. And we definitely have to start from there. And then, as Sarah was saying, looking at the whole of Scripture, it's a collection of books. I think that's a really key piece for me. A Bible, it means library. I mean, it's a collection of books, and they were written at different times in different eras, and they are shaped by the context in which they were written. We take our sacred texts extremely seriously. It's not that we dismiss what's there, but we look at what was the intent and what is the message and how does this speak to our life today, and what are the things that God, is getting across, what are the big themes that God is getting across over and over again. And, the passages that actually say anything directly related to sexual acts between people of the same gender, which is, I wouldn't even use the word homosexuality, because that came in the 1800s as an idea. I mean, the idea of two adults of the same sex being in a mutual, consenting, faithful, lifelong relationship in the way that we are just didn't even exist as a concept in the time of the Bible. And so those handful, they really are, about some very specific situations. There's only a few, whereas God talks a lot, and Scripture talks a lot, and Jesus talks a lot about the vulnerable, the poor, the widows and orphans is a phrase that's used over and over again. It's about caring for those who are on the edges and living in love. Love is an action, an activity, a way we relate to all human beings, not just romantic love. In fact, it has very little to say about romantic love. Again, a much later idea, really. But really about how we live moral lives and care for one another. And, that's the important thing. And, not that we're perfect, not that it doesn't take work, because it does.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of work, as any marriage does take work. But that's really our goal. And, there's nothing about our gender that makes us inherently immoral.
What advice would each of you have for persons who feel that they have been abandoned by the church because of their sexual orientation?
Well, the first thing I would say is the church does not represent God. And what I mean ideally, when we're at our best, we're supposed to represent God. We're supposed to be ambassadors for God. We're supposed to be ambassadors for Christ in the world. But the church is a human institution. Mm-hmm. And that means that it's flawed, that it's broken in places, that it's dysfunctional in places, and that no matter how hard we try, we're not always going to perfectly reflect God's will for us and God's will for the world. And so when I say the church doesn't represent God, what I mean is that if the church has mistreated you, that doesn't mean that God doesn't love you. It means the church is broken and in need of healing like every other human institution. So first of all, while acknowledging the hurt, just to try to reassure somebody that even if the church has abandoned them, God hasn't abandoned them, and God still loves and cares for them.
I was going to say, for a time, I really hoped that I could stay within the Church of England, because a lot of a good mentor had said, stay in and work to the change, be the change. And I really wanted to do that because that church it was woven into my core being. But actually, a church that doesn't allow you to be your full self, even though the pain of leaving, it still hurts. Find a community that does allow you to be your true self, because then you can flourish. Then you can really be that servant of Christ that you're called to be. You can go out into the world. And so there are communities out there. They might not be in every town or city, but they are available. So try and reach out, do some research on the internet, and find communities.
The two of you have had, I believe, different experiences with respect to finding a church or churches that embrace you. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, and I wanted to say a little bit when you asked kind of about the impact it's had in ministry. You know, we talked about the ordination process itself and the early years of ministry, but we've both been ordained for over 10 years now. And one of the big impacts has been in finding jobs, frankly. You know, this has been true, I think, for Sarah more so than me because she's transitioned between positions more than I have. But even when I was coming out of seminary, my bishop, who'd been great back in Ohio, said, you know, there's only a handful of churches here in our diocese that would hire someone who is openly a woman partnered with another woman. And none of them are hiring right now. So he was really upfront with me and said, look, I'm going to release you, as it's called, to look at other places. And I was fortunate to find a church in Philadelphia that was a good place for me to begin and learn. And then Sarah moved over and joined me there. But one thing that we have found along the way is that it is very limiting in where we can serve. Yeah. And so I know, you know, and we were always upfront about it. I mean, that's the other thing, because if it's going to be a reason someone's not going to hire us, we put it in the cover letter when we're applying. That's not the first thing we say about ourselves, of course, because the first thing has to do with why you feel you might be a good fit for that church. But about the third paragraph down, where most people mention family, you know, we always would mention each other because we figure better to discount us. But the more discouraging thing is the number of times, especially for Sarah, of getting that initial interview, going through the process, a church clearly thinking they were ready for this, getting down to the final 2 or 3 and that last interview, and then the position going to someone whose family structure looks more conventional. And that has been frustrating over the years, and has definitely, you know, been one of the hardships that we have faced together. We've never both been in full-time employment in our 10 years of marriage, and that's partly because of the limitations of being young women and being married to one another. You know, that's a number of strikes against you depending on the context.
Thank you for viewing our program today, and please join us again on Annapolis Mosaics. If you would like more information about the Annapolis Human Relations Commission, jot down the information on your screen. You can reach us at 410-263-7998 or by email at hrcommission@annapolis.gov, or check out our page at the City of Annapolis website. Go to www.annapolis.gov, click on City Government, then Boards and Commissions, and scroll down to the Human Relations Commission page. And always remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "We have flown the air like birds and swum the seas like fishes, but have yet to learn the simple act of walking the earth as brothers and sisters."